So today we conclude with finance and the real economy, the discussion of the agenda of a progressive political economy. Now, before I go ahead, let me give you an idea of the plans for the remainder of the course. So next week, the theme will be globalization and world order. Governing the world without world government. And I might begin that today if there is time. In the final 2 weeks of the course, because we only have after this 3 classes left, the first of those classes will be about globalization. And the last 2 weeks will be about the underlying theoretical presuppositions and commitments of the course. So in the next to the last class, the theme will be the theory of structure, of structural change and structural discontinuity in history, and the treatment of this great theme in social theory. And the implications of our ideas about structure for the way that we think about social and political alliances and antagonisms. And in the last class, the theme will be the ideal, the normative direction of these arguments, and the conception of humanity, of human nature that informs them. So that's the program of the course. Now, I have been dealing with what I regard as the core of a progressive project, which is the definition of the central themes, the central structural themes of a progressive political economy. The relation of the backward to the advanced parts of production, the relation of labor to capital, and now the relation of finance to the real economy or to the productive agenda of society. That progressive political economy then needs to be complemented in a larger view of the progressive project by the other themes that we have touched on during the course. The creation of a high-energy democracy, a mobilized democracy that no longer needs crisis to make change possible. The deepening of democracy is the indispensable counterpart to the democratization of the market order. Another theme is the reorientation of the character of education as a central part of the idea of the haven of capability assuring endowments in which we seek to secure the individual worker and citizen so that all around him there can rage a storm of innovation and change. And finally, the self-organization of civil society outside the market and outside the state, because only an organized society, a self-organized society, can generate alternatives and act on them. So those themes altogether, the 3 economic ones and these 3 non-economic ones, together compose the basic architecture of what I am imagining as a contemporary progressive project. Now then, our theme today of finance in the real economy. And by finance, I mean above all external or autonomous finance, that is, finance external to the productive organizations. Traditionally, it's the banking sector, but now we know it includes much more. So we label it more generally the capital markets. And it includes many non-financial organizations that perform financial functions, including the so-called shadow banking sector. Now, the premise of the entire discussion is the very premise that has played a central role throughout the arguments here in the semester, namely the idea that a market order has no single natural and necessary form. The market economy does not have a natural form. And we proceed then by reimagining the market, by reshaping its legal and institutional architecture. It's more important to change this architecture than it is to regulate the established form of the market or to compensate for the inequalities that it generates through retrospective tax and transfer. And now this central premise of the institutional indeterminacy of the market idea gains a special application in the arrangements that govern the relation of the market of production of the real economy to finance. The variability of that relation is a species of the more general idea of the institutional indeterminacy of the market order. Now, the orthodox way of thinking about finance and its relation to the economy as a whole is a corollary of the conception, which I have criticized, that the market economy has a single natural and necessary form. The centerpiece of the orthodox way of thinking about finance is that a perfectly competitive capital market automatically or spontaneously allocates resources to their most efficient use. If it fails to do so, if there is a defect somehow in the operation of the capital market, it must be because of some localized flaw in competition, some form of imperfect competition, including asymmetries of information, or else because there is a defect in the localized regulatory response to the localized competitive flaw. That's a summary of the orthodox way of thinking. Now, I want to claim that this orthodox way of thinking about finance and its relation to the real economy, to production, is unable to explain three great enigmas that characterize the reality of finance in the contemporary economies. The first enigma is that to a very large extent, to an overwhelming extent, the production system is self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. over 80%, maybe over 90% of the funding of production is internally generated within the production system. And nevertheless, outside the production system, there is a vast amount of liquid capital in the banks and in the stock markets. And this observation, this simple observation, arouses a disquieting question. What is the point of all of that money if it has no obvious relation to the funding of the productive agenda of society? So most of financial activity in these economies, under the established institutional architecture of the market order, has only an episodic or an oblique relation to the funding of production. Episodic, for example, in initial public offerings, or oblique in the extent to which the markets, the equity markets, the stock market, establishes a benchmark of value for the publicly listed firms against which they can theoretically borrow. Now, in fact, the great majority of them don't borrow. So in order to place this thesis in context, we can distinguish in these contemporary economies three main worlds of firms, of non-financial firms, in the character of their relation to finance. So first there are the characteristic successful large firms with large pools of technology and of capital, of liquid capital. And they, for the most part, don't lend from they don't borrow from external finance to finance production. On the contrary, they have large liquid pools of capital, and they frequent the financial markets in order to participate in the gains of financial activity. Then there's a second world of largely small, mainly backward firms, like family business. The world of the petty bourgeoisie, of the small business class. And small business throughout the world is dependent mainly on family saving and self-exploitation to finance its activities. Self-exploitation meaning that people work extravagant hours in order to maintain their business. There is some commercial lending done by these small businesses, but the total amount of consumer mortgage and credit card lending vastly exceeds in the portfolio of all the banks, the major national retail banks and the small local banks, the significance of this commercial lending, which occupies a small place in the portfolio of the banks. And that's because the small businesses are in fact largely dependent on themselves in the way that I just described. And then there's the third world of the startups, like the high-tech startups. They're the ones who are dependent on finance. But they're a tiny fraction of the production system and account for a tiny fraction of financial activity. So it's against the background of this division of the three worlds that I just described, very different from one another, that this disassociation of finance from production arises. Now, the second enigma is the asymmetrical relation of finance to the real economy. Finance is indifferent to the real economy in good times, for the most part, because the productive firms don't need this external finance, or they can't use it, as in the case of the small businesses. But finance is destructive to the real economy in bad times. So it's as if it became important only when it became destructive. That's the second enigma. Now, the third enigma is that what would seem to be the most important responsibility of finance, which is the funding of the creation of new assets in new ways, in fact occupies a minuscule part of the total activity of the capital markets. We associate that activity, for example, especially with venture capital. And even in the United States, which is the economy in the world where, together with Israel, venture capital is most established, it's a tiny part of the capital markets, something like 0.4%. Of GDP. It occupies a tiny part of financial activity. So if we put these three enigmas together, they point to the same problem. The problem can be described as three different aspects of this dissociation of finance, the accumulated saving, the postponed consumption of society, from the funding of the productive agenda, the agenda of production. And in the world which is marked by these three enigmas, what can happen, what does happen, is that as the utility of finance to society and to production diminishes, its prominence increases. It becomes bloated. So we could say there is financial hypertrophy, unaccompanied by financial deepening. Financial deepening would be the intimate association of finance with the real economy. And financial hypertrophy is the growth of finance, accounting for a larger and larger part of the profits of the private economy, and devouring a larger and larger part of the talent of the society. Without any corresponding benefit to the system of production. So, for example, in a recent year, about 40% of the graduates of Harvard College went to work for the finance houses and the management consultants. In other words, paper pushers of one kind or another in the periphery or the penumbra of this world of predatory speculative finance. It's a vast misuse, a vast misallocation of the human resources of society, as well as of its capital resources. Those are all aspects of this situation. So now, on the orthodox thesis with which I began, there can't be a problem. If there's a problem, it's just because of these localized competitive flaws or localized regulatory failures in the response to the competitive flaws. But what is denied in the orthodox way of thinking is that there could be institutional arrangements that would either tighten or loosen the relation of finance to the real economy. Either advancing either financial hypertrophy on one side or financial deepening on the other side. That's what's denied. Now, this is not just a thesis about what could be in the future. It's also a thesis with historical application. I gave earlier in the course an example in the United States in early 19th century history. In the democratization of the capital markets in the early republic. The contest over the National Bank under the presidency of Andrew Jackson. The Second National Bank of the United States was dissolved. And for over 100 years, no bank was allowed to operate in the United States in more than one state of the Union. And the Americans built the most decentralized system of credit at the disposal of the local producer, and not just the local consumer, that had ever existed in the world. This was clearly an institutional change representing, according to the circumstances of that time, of that economy, an advance in financial deepening. The possibility of which is denied by this mainstream way of thinking, this orthodox way of thinking. So the simple thesis is that the institutional arrangements, the institutional alternatives, can either loosen or tighten the relation between finance and the real economy. This possibility acquires programmatic interest under a very simple idea. And the simple idea is that the best way to make finance less dangerous is to make it more useful. And making it more useful means tightening the relation of finance to the real economy. Now, before I go further and illustrate this proposition in the context of the recent history of financial crisis in the United States, let me stop and ask for your questions or comments about these initial ideas. Yes?
Why, in your opinion, or how, did finance become disconnected from production? Take, say, in the case of the United States. Was it always disconnected, or was there a particular series of historical developments that separated one from the other?
Well, this is a very natural question to ask and a very good question, but also a very troubling and difficult question. So let's go back to this example from American history. I gave twin examples. I gave the example of finance and I gave the example of agriculture. And you remember that when I gave those examples, I said that what really built the United States was the combination of a developmental project on top, organized by the state from the top down. That was Hamilton's project. With the selective democratization down below of the two sectors that were then most crucial to the American economy, agriculture and finance, by different devices. Because if there had been only the Hamiltonian project against the background of African slavery, the United States would not have become what it became. Its ascendancy, its rise is the result of this combination. Now, then I said, in subsequent moments in American history, there were more limited examples of this combination of selective democratization below and developmentalism above, but weaker and weaker. And then you can ask, well, why was it weaker? That's how I'm interpreting your question. And I think it was weaker because of the combination of two reasons: the weakness of democracy and the weakness of thought. So the weakness of democracy because the Americans organized a kind of proto-democratic liberalism. That was the nature of their constitutional order. And with a series of counter-majoritarian, anti-democratic devices designed to control popular influence on the government. These arrangements maintain political society at a low level of political mobilization. Initially, they imposed property and educational qualifications to the suffrage that were then later discarded as unnecessary. They created constitutional arrangements that deliberately perpetuated impasse between the political branches of government, establishing a kind of table of correspondences between the transformative reach of a political project and the severity of the constitutional obstacles that would have to overcome in order to be executed. And it created a very straitjacketed kind of federalism, which, contrary to the claim that the states would be laboratories of experimentation, suppressed the experimentalist uses of the federalist system. So this was like the Constitution against change and against the people. So I think that's the first fact, which had immense significance, because in an unequal society, in a class society, the democracy is the enemy, should be in principle the enemy of the class order. And the democracy was weakened at the outset by this constitutional architecture. The second large reason is I call the weakness of thought. So these agricultural and financial examples that I gave from American history should be seen, we should see them as illustrations of the general idea that a market order can be remade. But that's not how they saw them. That's not how the Americans ever saw them. So they never formulated or explicated or generalized the doctrine, which I've just stated, that a market order has no natural form, and that much more important than regulating it or compensating from its inequalities is changing it. That idea they never made explicit. And on the contrary, ever since, the dominant currents of thought in the United States, as throughout the West, have been that a market order does have basically a natural form. And that's the whole nature of market fundamentalism, one of the varieties of economics, that any spontaneous trading activity will automatically generate the basic institutions of private law that we know, the regime of property and contract as they exist and so forth. So it seems to me that the essence or the beginning of an answer to your question lies in this combination of the democratic deficit with the conceptual or ideological deficit, which then left the class order without its natural enemies, bereft of its natural enemies. Its natural enemies would be critical thought and democratic politics. And so a vacuum is created, and under this vacuum, the state embraces corporate power and financial influence. So I think that's the basic explanation to your question. That the Americans in this early Republican period had this fortunate invention, but it was their misfortune not to understand the logic of their own invention and not to derive the right institutional implications from what they had invented. So that even today, the story that I'm telling about the early republic, about agriculture and finance, isn't an orthodox story. That's not what you would learn when you studied American history. You'd learn something else. And so all of this is then, in some way, an extension of this recurrent idea that there's a shock in the world, there's an innovation, and the tendency is to downsize the innovation to the form that least disturbs the dominant interests and the established preconceptions. And then we get this. And I think you could go on and tell many other angles of this story, so that I've mentioned that the most important analytical achievement of legal thought in the 150 years from the middle of the 19th century to the end of the 20th century was the discovery that a market economy has no single natural and necessary form. And this was a discovery that the jurists made involuntarily. They set out to demonstrate the opposite. They set out to demonstrate that the free economy does have a natural form, and it was the project of 19th century legal science to demonstrate it. But when they tried to work that idea out in detail, they couldn't do it. And they arrived at conclusions like the conclusions of Oliver Wendell Holmes, that if you start from the abstractions of contract and property and go down the ladder of concreteness in the definition of rules and institutional arrangements, at each turn, at each rung of the ladder, you'll have choices to make. And you won't be able to make those choices or to explain the way you make them by inference from the abstract notion of the market. It will turn on conflicts of interest and conflicts of vision. That's what these jurists discovered. And therefore, the market has no single natural and necessary form. That's the implication. But that idea, to this day, has not penetrated the inner sanctum of practical economic thinking. So even to this day, the impulse of the economists is to think a market is a market, property is property, and contract is contract. All propositions which the jurists know to be false. Now, we're not talking about the mysterious, about a mystery that separates different classes, different cultures. We're talking about the people on the other side of the street. And so this is really quite fantastic feature of the contemporary societies, this hyper-segmentation of insight, which then creates this fog, this darkness within which the affairs of society are conducted. So that's how I would answer your question. A very suggestive question. Yes.
In the context of the United States, I don't know if this is necessarily like the universal truth, but I've read a lot that a lot of members of Congress and people who are generally in the space where they do financial systems regulation have said that regulating the finance industry from a legal perspective tends to be really difficult because people who are involved in it always tend to find loopholes. So in terms of like actually embedding some of these reforms into the way that the finance industry is regulated, is it ever an industry that can be regulated because it's so driven by greed to the point where it's like it's very difficult to sort of.
Well, let me come to this question then in the next step, because I want to speak about then the financial crisis, and especially the financial crisis of 2008 and the run-up to it. And that's a way of addressing your question. So we just had this event just a few years ago, 2008, in which the epicenter of a global financial crisis was the United States. And then it spread out to the world, and it eventually went beyond the finance to the real economy. It damaged real finance, real economic activity. And how are we to understand it? So there were two aspects in the causal background to this crisis. So one aspect was the contradiction in the United States and these other societies between a strategy of growth based on mass consumption and also, therefore, on debt and credit, and the aggravation of inequality. So in the second half of the 20th century, especially from the 1970s on, there was a sharp increase of inequality of wealth and income in the United States, as well as in many other Western societies. And this is, of course, all against the background of the collapse of mass production industry and its substitution by the insular knowledge economy, a major theme of our previous discussion. Now, and in that whole historical period, I think it's fair to say, and I've said before in the course, the United States has not had a strategy of economic growth. The strategy of economic growth of the United States can be summarized in two words: cheap money. And it has not been implemented by the national government. It's implemented by the central bank, the Federal Reserve. And so the Federal Reserve makes money cheap and finances consumption. So there's no productivist project. Now, there's a contradiction. How did the Americans manage to maintain a strategy of economic growth based on mass consumption in the face of aggravating inequality? And a large part of the answer to that question is they squared that circle by resorting on a massive scale to debt and credit. which in turn was made possible in part by the overvaluation of the housing stock as collateral. And this external expansion of leverage was in turn enabled by the structural imbalances in the world economy. So in the world of the early 21st century, the single greatest motor of growth in the world economy was the relation between the United States and China. So the Americans had commercial trade and capital deficits, and the Chinese had trade and capital surpluses, and they complemented each other. And each of these two societies used this structural imbalance. In the case of the Chinese, it's surpluses. In the case of the Americans, it's deficits, as a way of evading the imperative of structural change and having a productivist project with a structural content. So China needed to deepen its internal market, and still needs today to deepen its internal market. But the deepening of its internal market would have required massive redistribution among regions, sectors, and classes, and therefore would have been inherently conflictual and politically dangerous to an autocratic regime. So as much as it could, and for as long as it could, it exported this problem through this export-led growth, in which the exports, rather than complementing production for the internal market, replaced production for the internal market. And the Americans did the same thing on the other side. So the Americans depended on credit and debt. And when they were no longer able to pay for it by their excessive, their extravagant domestic leverage, the money came from outside. And especially from the Chinese. So it was a way of, and so the United States used that as a way of evading the imperative of having a structuralist project. The country was the home of this knowledge economy in the form of high technology manufacture. But instead of deepening and disseminating this vanguard, it allowed it to persist in these fringes in this island, and therefore not to solve the problem of the rise of productivity of economic growth. So the problem was solved the sort of the cheap way. Mass consumption through debt, the debt enabled by these structural imbalances and so forth. So that was the background. Then comes as a response to that the stimulus. Now, the stimulus was always a temporary solution, an expedient. So it's not a solution, but it's also not bad. You could say it's useful or indispensable as a temporary response. But it was wasted because it was used to bail out the banks. It was not used to diminish inequality. It was not used to finance the transition from declining mass production industry to a deepened and inclusive form of the knowledge economy. So in that sense, you could say the crisis was squandered. and the direct expression of the squandering of the transformative uses of the crisis was that the stimulus did not prefigure any productivist project as it might have. Now then, the second aspect of the causal background to the crisis had to do with the failure adequately to regulate finance. And this then comes to your question. And this is a common view. So finance was deregulated, and the Americans didn't keep their eyes on the ball. They didn't pay attention to the squeaky wheel of finance and that kind of thing. It's a half-truth. So the dominant regulatory strategy toward finance in the second half of the 20th century was what you could call regulatory dualism. There were two different sectors. There was a thickly regulated sector of the banks or the bank holding companies that are engaged in the business of commercial lending and federally insured deposits. That was one sector. And then there was the second thinly regulated sector inhabited by high net worth individuals and financial professionals. And the basic argument for this division between the two sectors was an argument of paternalism. The high net worth individuals and the financial professionals could take care of themselves. Now, what happened is exactly what you might have predicted. All of the activities that were prohibited in the thickly regulated sector were relabeled and repackaged and smuggled into the thinly regulated sector and practiced under different names. So those were, for example, all of the fancy options and derivatives in the secondary mortgage market. That form part of the immediate background to the crisis. Now then a major theme of the discourse became, we have to re-regulate finance. Now, what then did they do? There are 4 regulatory programs that were adopted. One program was to reestablish part of the old New Deal Glass-Steagall distinctions between the financial organizations that did proprietary trading and the financial organizations that operated on the basis of guarantees from the government, federally insured deposits. So back to some form of Glass-Steagall. Then the second was the new technocratic agenda of establishing in the federal government greater power to terminate and turn around failing banks, liquidation authority. The third program was the program of the international financial elite, headquartered with its base in the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, which was to raise the capital adequacy requirements of the financial organizations. And the fourth was consumer protection. The Consumer Protection Agency to protect the consumers of financial services. Now, what's interesting is the following, that none of these 4 regulatory programs did anything to reshape the relation of finance to the real economy. None of them had anything to do with this problem that I described as the central problem of financial hypertrophy versus financial deepening. So they did nothing to address the real causal background in the regulatory sphere. So that's another way in which the transformative uses of the crisis were squandered. So that's an elaborate way of answering your question about regulation. So, and you'll notice that not only did these regulatory programs not address this issue of hypertrophy versus deepening, but they didn't even repudiate the strategy of regulatory dualism, which to this day has remained unchallenged. And that was the immediate causal background of the crisis. This division between the two worlds, the thickly regulated and the thinly regulated. So there you have an account of this problem, and in which so every strategy of regulation, so every form of regulation is in principle the initial move in a strategy of reorganization. So that's the better way to think of regulation. The theorists of regulation think of regulation is how you manage the established market order. But the truth is that different ways of regulating are better understood as the initial steps in a possible strategy of reorganization. It's just that the particular ones that they came up with were all ones that had very limited transformative potential. And even in addressing the initial problem presented by this regulatory dualism. So any questions or comments about that story that I just told of the American experience? Yes.
So in both 2008 and 1929, regulation of the financial market seemed to depend on the preceding crisis. I remember in the Przeworski reading from earlier in the semester, one of the dilemmas that he says socialists face is that any kind of transition or seizure of assets or serious reorganization of the financial sector would result in economic crisis or could result in economic
Yes.
crisis. Because finance will either refuse to invest, raise their capital, or they'll flee.
Yes.
And I guess my question is there any kind of strategy or way for the progressive or a progressive project to successfully regulate finance, force it to invest or encourage it to invest in production without the danger of this kind of crisis being created or ensuing?
Well, I think it's not just regulation that might create the crisis. A stimulus is limited in its effect, because if the stimulus is too great, is too large, it also begins to disorganize the established economic arrangements and incentives. But it seems to me that there are two questions. One is the question of how far you go, what the magnitude of the stimulus or the regulation is. The other is the question of what's the direction. So, I mean, the brunt of these criticisms that I'm making on both sides, on the stimulus side, on the regulation side, is not that the American reformers took too few steps. It's that they took too few steps in the wrong direction. And so, if you have a correct understanding of the direction, then there's the prudential issue of how far can you go at any moment. That's a practical political question. And you can say you go fewer steps or more steps, but the problem arises if the steps are in the wrong direction, if they're the wrong steps in the wrong trajectory. That's the problem. And so they went very far in making money almost free for the wrong people. That's what I would say. And in a project that was bereft of productivist content. And remember now another example, the example of the war economy that I gave earlier in the course. Because so it's a wonderful example. There was massive resource mobilization, and there was radical institutional experimentalism together, all in this black box of the war economy, with spectacular results. So it's not as if the country were incapable of doing that. It was capable of doing that when it needed to. And then later you have this financial crisis in which it takes these measures that minimize the productivist potential of the changes. Huh?
I guess as kind of a follow-up there, even in the case of the war economy, I mean, that was a pretty substantial crisis. I know that one of the core principles of at least your progressive project is that change shouldn't be dependent on crisis.
Yes.
So I guess I wonder, how do we reconcile what appears to be crisis as what I see to be one of the only ways you should generate opportunities to regulate finance
Yes.
with the principles of the program?
Well, so let me generalize the problem which you present. So I say we need political and economic institutions that diminish the dependence of change on crisis. And then you can object and say, but the introduction of those institutions depends on crisis. There's the institution, the establishment of institutions that diminish the dependence of change on crisis also depends on crisis. So there's a vicious circle which we have to break at some point. Now, what helps in dealing with these vicious circles in history is having the right ideas. So what I would like to think is that the task of the imagination is to do the work of crisis without crisis. That's why we have imagination, so that we don't have to have a crisis, or we don't need to have as much of a crisis. And then we, the imagination works out the logic of the crisis without our having to undergo the crisis. Some such thing is our only recourse. Yes.
When you say the regulatory dualism is what was the proximate cause of the crisis, is it the dualism itself as a concept? It doesn't sort of seem so offensive to me. I know we have it in Australian financial law that, for instance, the super funds, which are obviously very large and sophisticated investors, have less protections for them.
Uh-huh.
Makes perfect sense. So is it the dualism itself, or is it just the lack of regulation of the system regulation?
Well, no, it's not just the dualism itself, but this regulatory dualism established a framework that was conducive to these abuses. So then, for example, what happened with these derivatives that created such problems in the secondary mortgage market? What happened is that devices that had been invented, financial derivatives, option contracts, as hedges against risk, were converted into instruments of gambling. And the initial justifications for the securitization of markets, the secondary mortgage market, seemed to be benign. That is, it was supposedly part of the attempt to democratize access to housing and so forth. But what was happening was that there were successive layers of financial engineering which used the initial transactions of the real economy as their pretext rather than as their real target. But they were becoming more and more distant from their original motivation. And so, and one has to be very precise about this, because this is not an argument against financial speculation. I think the speculative element in finance is legitimate in developing information and in organizing the allocation of risk. The problem is not the existence of a speculative element in finance. The problem is the disassociation of the speculative element of finance from production, in which it becomes just gambling, disassociated from the real economy. That's the problem, that this orthodox way of thinking makes it hard to get to. Yes.
So since the financial crisis, private markets investors have increasingly allocated capital towards real estate and infrastructure strategies, to the extent that those strategies now account for something like 25 to 33% of total private capital allocated, which is a far larger share than venture capital and is essentially to do with the development of new assets. They're just property, commercial housing, infrastructure. To what extent does that fit with your third enigma, which is that funding new asset development is a small share of
No, so say that. Go back to the beginning of your question. So say that again.
To summarize, more capital is going towards the development of real estate assets and infrastructure assets than is going towards venture capital.
Yeah.
And I'm curious.
Well, real estate is complicated as an example, right? Because real estate consumption. It's hard to think of it as expansion of the productive apparatus. I suppose it depends on which real estate. So what specifically are you thinking of?
What's the consumption versus development distinction you're drawing? I guess it's...
Well, because real estate, buying houses is it a form of consumption, or is it the development of the productive apparatus of society? That's the question. I don't think real estate's a complicated question. It's not obvious that it has to do with the expansion of production or the enhancement of productivity. It could, if it's part of the physical apparatus of production, but on the face of it, it's not.
So the view is essentially that if there is net new real estate developed, that is...
people have to live somewhere, right? But but that's part of the maintenance of the standard of living of the population. But it's not a direct contribution to the productive apparatus and the enhancement of productivity.
Okay.
Right? I mean, that conventionally, it's thought that way, that residential real estate is consumption. It's not the expansion of the productive apparatus. But I agree that it has a complicated place in the taxonomy because it serves more than one function.
Yeah, so new assets here are essentially productivity enhancing assets.
Yeah, when I say new assets, I mean new productive assets. The creation of new productive assets in new ways. And these productive assets can be intangible, as in the case of software. But I don't think of them as houses. Yes?
In terms of the cycle of the way that modern economic crises have seemed to sort of come up in the United States for I guess like since the Great Depression, I was reading somewhere that it's thought that that some level of financial crisis happens every 10 years. Obviously, some are more extreme than others. In terms of some of the alternatives that you suggested, I'm just would be puzzled for you to go over, I guess, how would structure, or I guess my question is, would structurally changing the financial system and its relationship with society, would that lessen the number of crises that happen and their severity, or would it just make it so that there's no crisis, isn't immune to crisis, I guess is my question.
Well, again, it's a complicated argument. Keynes had this idea that one of the things that makes a money economy different from an economy without money is that liquid capital, because of its liquidity, is pliable, can easily bear the imprint of our humors, of fear and greed, elation and despondency. And furthermore, finance operates within a context that it doesn't itself create. So the institutional framework of finance, like the institutional framework of the market economy as a whole, is not created in the market. This is a very important point to understand. So the market does not create its own institutional framework. Finance does not create its own institutional framework. Where do they come from? Where does the framework come from? It comes from thought and politics established in law. That's what the framework is. But it's not a self-creation of the market or of finance. And this is then an additional element of instability. So there is always going to be some element of instability that comes from these two sources: the liquidity of capital, and therefore the ease with which it bears the imprint of our humors, and the consequences of it operating within a framework that doesn't itself create, that is created for it. So this leads to all these complications. But I think that the general idea here that I'm proposing is that the dangers of this process are related to the extent to which finance is or is not intimately engaged with production. And that if we, and that the more dissociated it is from production, the more dangerous it becomes. And this was a debate that in the United States was prominent, for example, in the 1920s. Henry Ford said, the business of the company is to make things, to make cars, not to make money. And if it makes cars in the right way, the money will take care of itself. And the people who created General Motors said the opposite. The business is not to make cars, it's to make money. And so that leads to a very different vision of what the activity is. Now, then the next stage in the discussion is to say, well, what are we to do in the short term and in the long term? And I would say, in the short term, you could say the aim is to increase financial deepening rather than, and diminish financial hypertrophy through a series of negative and positive measures. So the negative measures are all those measures that would discourage or prohibit financial activity that has no colorable relation to the expansion of output or the enhancement of productivity. Let me give you an example related to the two examples we've been dealing with in this conversation. Take option contracts. So option contracts were invented actually in commodity markets. And in commodity markets, they have an indisputable function to assure liquidity. But then they were transported to equity markets. And in equity markets, it's not clear that they play such a function. And it's in the equity markets that they were then converted into devices of gambling. So you would say you have to have a view that attempts to view each financial activity in relation to production and productivity. So that would be the negative measures. And then there would be the positive measures in which you would say it's not enough to prohibit activities that have no colorable relation to production. You also want to multiply channels between the dormant capital of society and production. So, for example, there's a vast amount of money in the public and private pension systems of the world. Why cannot part of that money be placed in diversified portfolios that do the undone work of venture capital? So this would be like quasi-state or public venture capital funds financed through these diversified portfolios of pension money, investing in the creation of new assets in new ways. And the question of inordinate risk is then taken care of by diversification. The diversification in these portfolios and among these portfolios, they would be professionally managed under competitive and professional management and so forth. So you can imagine a series of negative and positive initiatives that would go in the direction of tightening the link between finance and production. Yes?
Just to sort of follow up on that, you mentioned the juxtaposition between Ford and General Motors and how one was operating solely for the purposes of profit
Yes.
and one was operating for the purposes of actually creating a product. In the case where you have two entities where one is driven for the sole purpose of profit and one is driven for the purpose of creating something, if you were to regulate that or create some sort of regulation that sort of encourages one philosophy over the other, is that not some level of like government imposition, and is that not like violating?
No, but I would say you wouldn't do that firm by firm, right? You would do that only by these systemic measures, not by some kind of direct firm by firm intervention. What matters is the character of the production system as a whole and its relation to finance. Now, and I think that this is complicated because if you ask the venture capitalists, they'll say, there's no lack of capital. There's a lack of good projects. So we have plenty of venture capital, but where are the projects? So it's not as if capital all by itself were a magical solution. So when we're discussing the deepening and dissemination of the knowledge economy. Capital is only useful if it's somehow coordinated with access to the other things you need: advanced technology, advanced practice, advanced capabilities, and so forth. By itself, it's very little, but it's part of this situation because these contemporary economies are being financialized. That's what financialization means. It means it's another word for what I'm calling hypertrophy, the disassociation of finance from real activity, and it's bloating. Now, this is all the short term. So what then is the long term? What's the general long-term direction? And here I recur to this idea of the capital auction. So what is the limit in the future? We can take as a thought experiment to imagine the radical development of these ideas. It's that all the productive assets of society are vested in funds or trusts that are managed independently of the government. They don't allocate resources in a discretionary basis. And then whoever uses them is the group of workers and technicians who can assure the trust of the highest rate of return over some defined period. So no one owns productive assets in perpetuity. Productive assets are borrowed and then used while they can be employed most efficiently. Now here's a conundrum about this. I've just described this capital auction that allocates resources to those who claim to use it most efficiently. The existing capital market under the orthodox financial or economic ideas already is this capital auction, because that's the claim of the orthodox ideas, that in fact the capital market, if it is really efficient and competitive, will allocate resources to their most productive users. So for example, with respect to a real historical experiment like the anarchic privatization in Russia in the 1990s of state resources, what was said at the time was, it doesn't matter who acquires these resources initially, because ultimately they'll get into the hands of the most efficient users anyway. So that's the claim of what the system already is. But you have to ask yourself whether the existing capital market is really like this regime that I'm describing, in which there's no perpetual property. So one way of describing it is to say it's a world in which there's capital, but there are no capitalists. There are no capitalists because no one owns perpetually anything, any major productive resource. Now, I would say that in an ideal market order, that shouldn't be the only form of property. That should be just one form of property. And that the traditional unified property right should continue to exist. Why? Because it makes possible what I described before. The unified absolute property right has the advantage of allowing someone, the owner entrepreneur, to do something that no one else believes in. So he doesn't have to negotiate any vetoes. He doesn't have to have any consensus. He believes in it, no one else believes in it, and he does it at his own risk. So we would always want that to be possible. But the question is whether we should want that to be the only form of property, rather than having a system in which the major productive resources of society are never owned perpetually. That's what I mean by a world in which there's capital without capitalists. So then the idea is that a market order, going back to the premise of the whole discussion, a market order has no single natural and necessary form. It has many forms. And these many forms don't have to exist in different market orders. They can coexist experimentally in the same market order. So in the same market order, there can be alternative regimes of private and social property and contract that coexist experimentally. And then we have this idea that the concept of economic rationality, radicalized, means that we don't just have freedom to recombine the factors of production, labor, capital, technology. We have freedom to innovate in the institutional framework of production and exchange. And that means the diversification or the multiplication of property and contract regimes in the same market order. So that's what I would see as the final stage of the discussion. But, yes?
So when you speak about having different kinds of regimes under the same
Yes.
market order for rights, my question is, it seems to me common understanding is that for every right there's a corresponding right to someone else, so maybe like a right and a duty, someone has a claim on someone else, someone else has
Uh-huh.
on them. What happens when these two groups have a dispute and they both believe they're working under different regimes that don't correspond to each other?
Well, you mean how do you coordinate these different regimes in society? No, I think that that each regime is collective, and so let me make it more tangible. So, with respect to the two central ideas of private law, contract and property. So, under the orthodox view, in the 19th century legal view, the standard form of property is the unified consolidated property right. So all of the constituent powers of property, which the civil law distinguishes as use, usufruct, and alienation. That is, the power to use, the claim to the income stream, and the right to buy and sell. Those powers all go together, and they're vested in the same right holder, who is the absolute owner. Now, by opposition to that is the idea of disaggregated property. Property is just a bundle of relations or a bundle of powers. And we can separate them and vest them in different tiers of right holders. And we would sometimes want to have a unified property right for the reason that I stated. But we wouldn't want that to be the only form of property. We'd also want to have a disaggregation of property that would allow many different tiers of right holders to have superimposed claims on the same productive resources. So in addition to investors, local governments, local communities, workers, and so forth. And they would, that would be a different sector, organizing a different world, which is still a market world. Now, then you could say, well, this illustrates a principle that I mentioned earlier in the course. At the most abstract level, a market, the idea of a market has at least two dimensions. One dimension is the absolute level of economic decentralization, the number of economic agents who can bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. The other dimension is the absoluteness of the control that each of those agents has over the resources at his command. So in orthodox thinking, legal and economic thinking, these two dimensions are inseparable. So the absolute decentralization and the absolute control go together. But they obviously don't go together. And in fact, there's a contradiction between them. Because one way of increasing the absolute level of decentralization is to diminish the absoluteness of the control. So for example, if your right to access is temporary, then you can have more people having access to those productive resources. So the capital auction that I just mentioned is an example of that idea. You have the productive assets, but no one has them perpetually. You have them temporarily while you're able to use them more effectively. Now, then you can say this, a similar thing with respect to the idea of contract, which is the other fundamental idea of private law about the market order. So the dominant idea of contract, of the orthodox ideas, contract is the bilateral executory promise. It's an arm's length transaction for an instantaneous exchange which is entirely exhausted in a single moment of performance in the future. By opposition to what? By opposition to the idea of a relational contract. A relational contract is an incomplete bargain in which what is contemplated is not a single performance in the future, but a series of performances, open-ended. And it is not fully bargained out. That's why we call it incomplete. And so that's another way of organizing a market order in which relational contracts, which, by the way, play a very important role in the knowledge economy and are used today, for example, in the relations among the pharmaceutical industries. Relational contracts become central. So instead of having a market order which is all organized around the unified property right and the bilateral executory promise, you now have a market order which is organized around these different forms of property and of contract. That is, I would say, a radicalization of the experimentalism of the market idea, not a form of governmental intervention. Because what we're saying is that the market can be experimental about itself, that that the nature of its institutional organization is part of its experimentation. It doesn't just combine things within an unchanged and unchallenged framework of production and exchange. It experiments about the framework itself. That's a superior form. Yes.
So in your description of the capital auction, you mentioned that allocation will be to those who can secure, reasonably can secure the most efficient use of capital.
Yes.
And that makes sense, but I'm wondering, why should efficiency be the value in this idea?
Well, it's not necessarily. So I think so how am I imagining this? I'm imagining that these public trusts, let's call them trusts, these public trusts who hold in trust the productive resources of society, there are many of them, and they don't operate all on the same criteria. They have different views. And they are accountable. Now, to whom are they accountable? They're accountable to the democratic institutions. So the democratic institutions observe the trajectory, the experience of these trusts. There are different ways of allocating capital. And they say, this is good, that's bad, that works well, that doesn't work well. So that the question of economic organization of the market order becomes an experimental question for judgment, for ex post evaluation. That's how I'm imagining it. And the funds themselves say they borrow out productive resources, which are a combination of physical capital and technology and liquid capital, to particular teams of workers and entrepreneurs. And then a few years later, someone says, give those to me. I can manage that more efficiently and make some credible claim of his basis for saying that and so forth. Now, someone said the other day, but of course this doesn't deal with the problem of hierarchy, of the hierarchy of competences in society. And that's true. It doesn't deal with that problem because it's not a panacea for the solution of all problems. But it is a reinvention of the market idea. The market idea should not be crucified and nailed to the cross of a single version of itself. There should be alternative versions of the market coexisting experimentally. That's the claim. That's the claim I'm making. Now, one more thing that I want to say, which is this. So, one thing which has been very hard for the progressives to understand or to accept is that the proletarian idea, the industrial proletariat, Marx's protagonist, is not the orientation of the majority of the human race. So if we define petty bourgeois, small business class, subjectively rather than objectively, it is the majority of humanity. So the predominant orientation is petty bourgeois. An informal worker in a Brazilian slum, a smallholder in an Indian village. What do they want? They aspire to a modest prosperity and independence. And the default form, the archaic target of this aspiration, in the absence of other ways of realizing it, is traditional, isolated, archaic family business. I want my little farm, I want my little shop, I want my little business. That's what the whole world wants. And so these ideas about the radicalization of the market are, among other things, an attempt to engage this aspiration and to redirect it, to present it with a larger menu of forms in which it can be realized as an alternative to the default form, which is the archaic, isolated, regressive, retrograde family business. And so that, or you could say also the individual agent who has lost a strong connection to any business enterprise. I gave the example of the machine repair person or the nurse practitioner. We want to transform them into a technologically equipped artisan. That's another example of this aspiration to independence. So, but this is a redirection of the concerns of the left. Yes?
Can we talk for a minute about the technologically equipped artisan?
Yeah, sure.
I'm conflicted here in that I see a lot of communities that I belong to, and I think that many people in them
Yes.
people are still going to get sick. And so I'm wondering about, of course I want everyone to have access to an education system that actually equips them, and I think the one you imagine is beautiful, but I worry about if everybody becomes artisans, who does this type of work that people are doing now that society still relies on?
Like what? Like what kind of work?
Nursing, retail, serving food, things
Yeah, so
there's no shame in that kind of work, but I understand that some people might want to, get a degree, go do something else. I'm just worried about what happens to those domains of society.
well, I think so. So this is on this question of labor, right? That those forms of labor that are purely repetitious, we can imagine as replaced by machines.
Well, probably
But
not nursing though, not nursing.
not nursing. No, not nursing. Not nursing. But nursing is precisely an example that I gave of how we can take the nurse and elevate her capacities through this partnership with the state. That's what I meant by technologically equipped artisan.
So they're doing the same work, they're just doing it better.
The nurse, yes, the nurse becomes such a technologically equipped artisan, and as after all, surgeons already are, as in robotic surgery and so forth, and so, and even very modest forms of work, like people who stack shelves in drugstores and supermarkets, can have the character of their day-to-day work transformed when part of it is routinized, but they then supervise or work with the machines. That's the basic idea that I'm imagining. It's the machines enhancing labor more than replacing labor. Some forms of labor that are purely formulaic and repetitious will be replaced by machines. But whenever possible, the character of work will be transformed and elevated. And that's then this idea that we hope for freedom in the economy and not just freedom from the economy through the overcoming of scarcity. Well, okay, there are two more questions, but there's no time. So what? Oh no, there is time. There is time. I'm sorry. It's the stupid thing of the odd 15 minutes. Yes.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I actually wanted to ask about pharma. I thought that was an interesting example that you brought up and like what that would look like in
Ask about which?
pharmaceuticals.
Yes.
And specifically, like right now, the way that pharma works in the world, really, right, is that the United States is basically exclusively responsible for the creation of drugs. They do that because they have a completely privatized system, and the companies like Bayer and Merck or whatever can afford to finance all of the research and development that happens in the pharmaceutical industry because they're recouping amazing amounts of money in the American healthcare system, which is completely privatized. And so I'm super curious what your thoughts are about what that would look like in an open economy. Like, would it have to become more?
You mean
global?
because of this thesis that the rest of the world is free riding on the Americans? Is that the idea?
I mean, I'm not saying there. Yeah, I guess that is what I'm saying. Yeah, like I mean that idea that like right now there's only a single country responsible for that, and also just like what does it look like if we were to make it like in your open market, like to have that be something that is in the market, like research being in the market. I mean, because the other problem of the American healthcare system is that the only things that really get funded for research are things that could be lucrative, like diseases that affect a large enough amount of the population that the pharmaceutical industry feels like they can recoup their costs. And so I'm wondering if there are ways that this new knowledge economy that you're
Of course
discussing.
there. I mean, of course there are many ways. So the alternative example is in the high technologies like the internet and so forth, which notoriously came from the defense industry. So that's the state that did it, right? So it's the state that took the lead in the heavy investments that then create these breakthroughs to another stage of technological evolution. And there are all sorts of combinations of financings of the third sector, of the universities, of the research assistant, of the research institutions, the transformation of intellectual property. There are many devices for the promotion of technological ingenuity and invention of this kind.
But are you saying then that it should be a completely public endeavor, that the government should always be funding the research that creates pharmaceutical breakthroughs?
What I'm saying, I don't know that that would be the best regime for the pharmaceutical industry. Maybe it would be, and in some countries I think it is, but I think that there's a practical question of what's the best way of funding frontier research, and in almost every economy in the world, state financing is a major part of it. There's no frontier research without the state. So, because the state acts without this short-term budget constraint, the state acts with the long-term future in mind. So it seems to me to be, in principle, a major part of the solution to this problem. And I do agree that making it depend on these private companies who then charge inordinate prices in the United States while the rest of the world rides on their innovations is not a tenable system in the long term, not tenable for the world. Yes?
Yeah, I'm hoping you can describe a little bit more how funds and trusts in this capital option model function differently than, say, pension funds do today, in so much as they essentially allocate capital towards fund managers or firms directly who they think will generate the highest rate of return, and they may even think about ESG concerns at some point.
Well, because they're not. It's not an investment in which they're right. In which they're lending the productive resources to people who can put them to use.
You mentioned they will both hold existing assets and lease them out, but they will also have liquid capital to invest.
Yes.
Much like.
That's right. That's right. So you take, and this is just obviously a sketchy idea. It's not an institutional blueprint. And I'm saying it's this idea in which you take the productive assets of society and you vest them in these trusts, who would then distribute them to those who are credentialed as their most promising users for a certain amount of time. And then under such a system, the main form of public finance ceases to be taxation, and it becomes the underlying rate, the threshold rate, which we call the rate of interest, for the use of these productive resources of society. That's the basic idea.
So the essential difference is shifting productive assets from firms to trusts.
The ownership, the quote, ownership of the productive assets that is held in these trusts. So the trusts hold the assets in trust for society. They don't belong to capitalists who are perpetual and absolute owners, and they don't belong to a state who is able to allocate them by some process of discretionary allocation. That's the idea. So, and that's why I think it's so in state socialism, the state succeeds to the capitalist. The state is an absolute owner, as the capitalist was. But in this system that I described, there is no capitalist. So who has the productive assets, you say? No one. Society has the productive assets. A series of people claim to be able to use them more effectively. And there's then a dispute or a competition, a contest. And there's not one source, there are many sources, so that's the system that I'm imagining. Yes?
How can these trusts be both independent but also accountable to the democratic institutions?
Well, they're independent in this sense that they do not allocate resources by some discretionary process. They're under professional management by managers, by experts. But the design of the system of trust, the scope of trust, the range of trust is subject to a democratic accountability. So the democratic institutions decide this system is working well, it's working poorly, we should revise it in such and such a way, we should allow these funds additional powers, we should take away some of their powers and so forth. I don't see any contradiction in that. They're accountable, so the people who manage them are rewarded, of course, but they don't own those assets, and they have careers like everyone else. And so you're not a manager of one fund, maybe you become a manager of another fund. But it's the democratic institutions then pass on the legitimacy of this entire scheme. I don't see a contradiction in that. I think there are 1,000 practical questions that would arise in the operation of such a system. But no single contradiction. Yes?
This might be a stupid question. I guess I'm just confused by what you proposed in terms of like the way we operate the trust versus like how they currently operate. Like as it currently stands in the United States, if like a trust becomes too powerful or like has too many assets, there's nothing the government can do about it.
Well, wait a minute, now I'm confused. You say, you're talking about it as if these trusts already existed. They don't exist, right? So what?
Well, I guess like hypothetically, if a trust attains that level of like financial power as it currently stands, there's nothing the government can do about it.
If the trust?
Like as it like trust in terms of like the like other people managing like a large trust, like a fund of people's like money, like pooled assets.
I'm confused now. So these are the productive resources. These are productive resources, right?
Right.
It's a mixture of liquid capital technologies, physical, tangible and intangible capital mixed together in these pools. And then there are teams of entrepreneurs and workers and technicians who are vying for access to the deployment of these productive resources. And they're saying, I can do this better than these other people. So that's how it's working. The function of the managers of the trust is a technical function. And it's true that they could differ among themselves in the extent to which they take into account certain positive externalities, as the economists call them, that is, additional benefits to society. But I'm imagining that their main use is for production. That is, these are the instruments of a productivist project, in which, as Henry Ford said, the object is not to make money, it's to make things. Yes?
We don't have these kinds of pools of money and resources at a larger public scale, but we do have them like in insular communities. For example, you go to Harvard
In?
in insular communities. So for example, at Harvard University, we actually have this model of there's hundreds of different competitions that you can propose.
Yes.
A business or social venture, a nonprofit, something you want to do, even a fellowship.
Yes.
And then you compete with a bunch of other people who are going for this, and they team, and they
Yes, of course. Of course. So
Maybe bring this to all of society instead of just having Harvard come and do it for Harvard.
yes, of course. So this is a little privileged world in which the universities have this among themselves. There's a series of rewards and promotions and so forth. But it is a truncated example of a diversification that could take place on a much larger scale. I think that this is a, I don't imagine this as any defined institutional proposal. It really is a thought experiment. And the interest of the thought experiment is to push to the limit the question of what we mean by a market. Now, it seems to me that this system that I've described is very definitely a market. But is it what Karl Marx would call capitalism? It's a radical change in the legal and institutional architecture of the market economy. And those short-term changes that I described of encouraging the financial activities that contribute to production and discouraging the ones that don't, and multiplying the channels between dormant capital and production, I see them as initial steps in some direction. And then you have to ask, well, what is the direction? Because everything depends